History is a tapestry woven with countless stories, but some of its most haunting threads are the unexplained deaths of figures we thought we knew. Think of Cleopatra, the legendary queen who ruled Egypt with unmatched brilliance, her final moments shrouded in mystery, with whispers of suicide, murder, or even a carefully staged disappearance. Or Napoleon Bonaparte, the conqueror who reshaped Europe, only to die in exile under circumstances so suspicious that even modern scientists still debate whether he was poisoned. And then there's Edgar Allan Poe, the master of the macabre, whose own death mirrored the eerie tales he penned, found delirious in the streets, wearing clothes that weren't his, with no explanation ever satisfying the endless speculation. These aren't just footnotes in history, they're gaping holes in our understanding of the past, riddles that refuse to be solved no matter how many clues we uncover. What makes these deaths so captivating isn't just the lack of answers, it's the way they force us to confront how little we truly know, even about the most famous lives ever lived. For every grand achievement, every empire built or masterpiece created, there's often an ending that defies logic, leaving us to piece together fragments of evidence like detectives in an unsolved case. And the deeper you dig, the more unsettling it becomes. Medical reports that contradict eyewitness accounts, political enemies with perfect motives but no proven involvement, even bodies exhumed centuries later only to raise new questions instead of closing the case. These mysteries aren't just academic exercises, they're visceral reminders that history is never as tidy as textbooks make it seem. In this video, we're unraveling 30 of history's most baffling final chapters, stories of kings and artists, scientists and explorers, all united by one thing: their deaths are puzzles that still keep experts awake at night. Some involve whispers of conspiracy, others bizarre coincidences that defy explanation, and a few are so strange they'd seem like fiction if the evidence weren't staring us in the face. But this isn't just about listing unsolved cases, it's about stepping into the shadows of the past where every clue leads to more questions, and even the most accepted theories crumble under scrutiny. So settle in, because by the end, you'll see history not as a series of neat conclusions, but as a labyrinth of mysteries waiting to be explored. Alexander the Great's death is one of history's most tantalizing puzzles, a conqueror who reshaped the ancient world, only to meet his end at just 32 years old under circumstances so murky they've fueled debate for over 2,000 years. Officially, his demise was attributed to illness, with theories ranging from malaria to typhoid fever, but the timeline of his symptoms reads like a thriller. After a sudden fever struck him down in Babylon, he deteriorated rapidly, suffering agonizing pain, paralysis, and periods of delirium, hardly the quiet fade of a natural illness. Even more suspicious, this was a man whose enemies had every reason to want him gone. His generals, already jockeying for power as his empire began to fracture, stood to gain immensely from his absence. The atmosphere in his final days was thick with tension. Whispers of betrayal hung in the air, and the question of who might have slipped poison into his wine became impossible to ignore. Ancient historians like Plutarch and Diodorus left conflicting accounts, some hinting at a slow-acting toxin like white hellebore, a plant known for its lethal properties. Others pointed to the bitter feud between Alexander and his closest companions, particularly Antipater, the governor he'd recently threatened to replace. Then there's the eerie detail that his body allegedly refused to decompose for days, an observation later seized upon as possible evidence of arsenic poisoning, which can delay decay. But here's the twist: modern forensic studies of his symptoms don't conclusively match any single poison or disease, leaving us with a maddening blend of possibilities. Was it a meticulously planned assassination, or simply the cruel caprice of fate striking down a man who seemed invincible? What makes this mystery endure isn't just the lack of answers, it's the sheer irony of it all. Alexander had survived countless battles from the deserts of Persia to the mountains of India, only to perish in his own palace, surrounded by men whose loyalty was far from certain. His death didn't just end a life, it ignited a power struggle that tore his empire apart, reshaping the ancient world in ways he never intended. And that's the real tragedy. The greatest military mind of his age left no clear successor, only a legacy fractured by war and a death that still feels like an unsolved crime. Ambrose Bierce didn't just write about dark endings, he lived one. The sharp-witted satirist, famous for his cynical wit and chilling tales like an occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge, vanished without a trace in 1913 while traveling through revolutionary Mexico. It was the perfect finale for a man who'd spent his career skewering hypocrisy and romanticism, as if life had decided to imitate his own bleak fiction. His last known communication was a letter to a close friend, boasting with typical Bierce flair, "As to me, I leave here tomorrow for an unknown destination." Then nothing, no body, no grave, not even a credible witness to his final moments, just silence. Theories about his fate spiral in every direction. Some say he was executed by Pancho Villa's rebels, caught in the crossfire of a revolution that showed no mercy to outsiders. Others insist he staged his own disappearance, a final act of control from a man who'd long toyed with the idea of suicide. There's even a tantalizing rumor that he slipped away to South America, living out his days under an assumed name, though no evidence has ever surfaced. The most haunting possibility that he got exactly the death he'd once written about, sudden, ambiguous, and stripped of sentimentality. What makes Bierce's vanishing so compelling isn't just the mystery, it's the eerie symmetry. Here was a writer who'd spent his life dissecting the absurdity of human existence, only to exit the stage in a way that felt ripped from his own pages. Even the details feel scripted, a 71-year-old cynic riding into a war zone, sending one last sardonic note, then evaporating like a character in one of his twist endings. The lack of closure is almost poetic. No burial site to visit, no final confession to pass, just a void that invites us to keep searching, as if the truth might somehow be as layered and unsettling as his stories. And that's the real genius of Bierce's disappearance. It forces us to confront how easily a life, even one as vividly documented as his, can dissolve into legend. Historians have combed military records, dug through desert graves, and chased leads across continents, yet the man who once quipped death is not the end. There remains the litigation over the estate, left no estate to litigate, just a question mark towering over his legacy, proving that sometimes the most fitting end for a master of irony is the one that refuses all explanation. Edgar Allan Poe's death is as haunting and enigmatic as the tales he crafted, a final act so shrouded in confusion that it feels like one of his own macabre stories. On October 3, 1849, the famed writer was discovered on the streets of Baltimore, delirious and dressed in clothes that weren't his own, mumbling incoherently about a mysterious figure named Reynolds. He was rushed to a hospital where he slipped in and out of consciousness, never able to explain what had happened during his missing days. 4 days later, he was gone. The official cause of death was listed as congestion of the brain, a vague term that only deepened the mystery. Theories about Poe's final days range from the tragic to the sinister. Some point to his long struggle with alcoholism, suggesting he succumbed to delirium tremens after a severe binge. Others propose he fell victim to rabies, a theory bolstered by reports of his aversion to water in his final hours, a classic symptom of the disease. But there are darker possibilities too. Baltimore at the time was notorious for its violent, couping elections where gangs would kidnap men, force them to vote repeatedly under different names, and then abandon them, often beaten or drugged. Could Poe have been a victim of this brutal practice, or was there something more personal at play? The absence of a clear narrative only fuels the speculation. Poe had been traveling to New York to marry his childhood sweetheart, yet he never arrived. His trunk and belongings were found at a boarding house, but no one could account for his movements. Even the clothes he wore when found, a cheap, ill-fitting suit, seemed deliberately out of character for the fastidious writer. And then there's the cryptic name he repeated, Reynolds. Some believe it referred to a naval officer Poe had criticized, hinting at possible revenge. Others think it was a hallucination, a fragment of his unraveling mind. What makes Poe's death so endlessly fascinating isn't just the unanswered questions, it's the eerie symmetry. Here was a man who spent his life exploring themes of madness, loss, and the fragility of human reason, only to meet an end that mirrored his darkest imaginings. There's a grim poetry in the way his final days remain as elusive as the ghosts in his stories, as if he'd written his own tragic epilogue, and perhaps that's the point. Poe understood better than anyone that the most terrifying tales aren't the ones with clear resolutions, they're the ones that linger in the shadows, just out of reach, leaving us to wonder what really happened in the dark. Napoleon Bonaparte's death in exile on the remote island of St. Helena in 1821 remains one of history's most hotly debated medical mysteries. Officially, the fallen emperor succumbed to stomach cancer, a diagnosis supported by his family's history of the disease and his own reported symptoms: severe abdominal pain, vomiting, and dramatic weight loss in his final months. But from the moment his body was autopsied by British physicians, skepticism swirled. The official report described a stomach lesion the size of a fist, yet several attending doctors noted peculiar details that didn't quite fit the cancer narrative. Some observed his liver was unusually swollen, while others whispered about the presence of arsenic's telltale signs: brittle hair and skin lesions, though these findings were conspicuously absent from the final documentation. The poisoning theory gained traction decades later when forensic analysis of Napoleon's hair samples revealed staggering arsenic levels nearly 40 times what's considered normal. Proponents of foul play point to his British captors, who had every reason to fear his potential return to power. St. Helena's governor, Sir Hudson Lowe, notoriously tightened restrictions on Napoleon's household, leading to speculation that someone in his inner circle, possibly a disgruntled servant or a political opportunist, could have administered slow doses. Yet here's where the plot thickens. Arsenic was everywhere in 19th century life, used in everything from wallpaper pigment to headache remedies. The same hair samples showing high arsenic levels also revealed fluctuating concentrations over time, suggesting environmental exposure rather than deliberate poisoning. Perhaps the most compelling argument comes from modern pathology. A 2007 study comparing Napoleon's autopsy report with contemporary cancer cases found striking similarities to advanced gastric carcinoma, including the described stomach perforation. His father had died of the same illness, and genetic testing later identified a mutation linked to hereditary stomach cancer. But even this seemingly definitive evidence leaves room for doubt. Why did Napoleon himself, in his final coherent moments, allegedly whisper, "I die before my time, murdered by the English oligarchy"? Was it the paranoia of a broken man, or a deathbed accusation with chilling truth behind it? The real intrigue lies in how perfectly Napoleon's death mirrors his life, a collision of fact and myth, where politics and science refuse to align. Whether by cancer or conspiracy, his demise secured something far more powerful than a mere end. It transformed him into a martyr. The British, by exiling him, had hoped to erase his influence. Instead, they gave history an unsolvable riddle, ensuring Napoleon's legend would outlive not just his captors but the centuries themselves. And that's the ultimate irony. The man who once dominated Europe through sheer force of will continues to dominate our imagination through the enigma of his death. King Tutankhamun's death feels like a riddle wrapped inside an enigma, buried beneath layers of golden artifacts and centuries of speculation. The boy king, who ascended to Egypt's throne at just 9 years old, ruled for a mere decade before his sudden demise around 1324 BC, leaving behind a tomb so intact it would become the most famous archaeological discovery of all time. But for all the treasures unearthed, his untimely end remains a mystery, teetering between accident, illness, and something far more sinister. Early theories painted his death as the result of a chariot accident, a notion fueled by the discovery of his fractured leg and the presence of ceremonial chariots in his tomb. Some scholars suggested he might have been crushed during a hunt or military drill, his youth and inexperience making him vulnerable to such a mishap. But modern CT scans tell a more complicated story. While the leg injury was severe, it likely wasn't fatal on its own. Instead, researchers found evidence of a hastily mummified body with signs of possible trauma to the skull, reigniting whispers of assassination. Could Tutankhamun have been murdered by a rival faction, perhaps even his own advisors, eager to replace the young ruler with someone more pliable? The plot thickens when you consider the political chaos of his reign. Tutankhamun inherited a kingdom in turmoil, his father Akhenaten having upended Egypt's religious order by replacing the traditional gods with the sun deity Aten. Tutankhamun's restoration of the old pantheon would have made him enemies, especially among those who'd profited under his father's radical reforms. Then there's the eerie presence of other mummies in his tomb's vicinity, including 2 stillborn fetuses, suggesting a dynasty cut short by violence or desperation. Yet science offers another twist. Genetic testing revealed Tutankhamun suffered from multiple hereditary disorders, including a clubfoot and malaria, which would have left him frail and in constant pain. Some experts argue these conditions, compounded by the leg fracture, could have led to a fatal infection. But even this theory doesn't fully explain the skull damage or the peculiar haste of his burial, which lacked the meticulous care typically afforded to pharaohs. What makes Tutankhamun's death so endlessly debated isn't just the conflicting evidence, it's the way each clue seems to lead to another question. The damage to his skull could be from an assassination blow or from the embalming process. The fractured leg might point to an accident or a staged attack. Even the fetuses in his tomb raise more questions than answers. Were they his unborn heirs, casualties of a genetic curse, or something darker? In the end, Tutankhamun's story is less about solving a mystery and more about embracing the unknown. His death, like his life, is a mosaic of fragments, some lost to time, others waiting to be deciphered. And perhaps that's why his legend endures, not because we've uncovered the truth, but because we're still chasing it, drawn by the whispers of a boy king whose final chapter refuses to be written. Amelia Earhart's disappearance is the kind of mystery that refuses to fade, a vanishing so perplexing it sparked decades of searches, theories, and even government cover-up rumors. On July 2, 1937, the pioneering aviator and her navigator, Fred Noonan, vanished somewhere over the Pacific during their daring attempt to circumnavigate the globe. The last confirmed radio transmission placed them near Howland Island, a tiny speck of land barely visible from the air, but no wreckage was ever found there. The official explanation pointed to a tragic crash after running out of fuel, but the lack of concrete evidence left the door wide open for speculation. One of the most persistent theories suggests Earhart and Noonan might have crash-landed on Gardner Island, now called Nikumaroro, hundreds of miles off course. Over the years, tantalizing clues have emerged. A jar of freckle cream, Earhart famously disliked hers, pieces of aluminum matching her plane's construction, and even skeletal fragments initially dismissed but later re-evaluated as potentially matching her frame. Then there's the eerie radio distress signal picked up by amateur operators days after her disappearance, calls for help mentioning a ship on reef and water rising, though authorities at the time dismissed them as hoaxes. Another thread in this tangled web involves claims of Japanese capture. Some researchers argue Earhart's plane may have strayed into Japanese-controlled territories where she was taken prisoner, possibly even executed as a spy. Declassified U.S. intelligence files mention unverified reports of a white woman held in Saipan around the time of her disappearance, and locals later recounted stories of an American aviatrix buried there. But without definitive proof, these accounts remain shrouded in ambiguity. Recent expeditions have only deepened the intrigue. Underwater sonar scans near Nicumaroro revealed an anomaly resembling a plane's shape, though poor visibility has prevented confirmation. Meanwhile, forensic analysis of those long-ignored bones suggests they likely belonged to a woman of European descent, roughly Earhart's height. Even the freckle cream jar, once seen as circumstantial, gains weight when you consider how few Western women would have been in that remote region in the 1930s. What makes Earhart's story so compelling isn't just the mystery, it's the symbolism. She wasn't just a pilot, she was a symbol of defiance, a woman who shattered expectations in an era when aviation was a man's world. Her disappearance feels like a betrayal of the very audacity that defined her, leaving us to wonder if the truth is buried in some uncharted atoll, hidden in wartime archives, or simply lost to the vastness of the Pacific. And perhaps that's why we keep searching, because finding her would mean reclaiming a piece of that bold spirit, pulling it back from the abyss of the unknown. The irony is, Earhart herself once said, "Adventure is worthwhile in itself." Maybe the greatest adventure of all is the one we're still on, the quest to solve the riddle she left behind. Every sonar ping, every bone fragment, every crackling radio signal from the past is another step in a journey that refuses to end. And until the ocean gives up its secrets, we'll keep chasing the shadow of a woman who vanished into legend. Socrates' death wasn't just an execution, it was a performance, a chilling final act staged by a democracy terrified of his influence. In 399 BC, the 70-year-old philosopher stood trial in Athens, accused of corrupting the youth and disrespecting the gods. The charges sound almost trivial today, but in a city still reeling from political upheaval and military defeat, Socrates' habit of questioning everything, even the foundations of Athenian society, made him a dangerous figure. His trial was less about piety and more about power, a desperate attempt by fragile leaders to silence a man whose relentless critical thinking exposed their hypocrisy. The historical record paints a vivid picture of his final hours. Condemned to drink a lethal dose of hemlock, Socrates spent his last day surrounded by grieving disciples, calmly discussing the immortality of the soul as if death were just another intellectual puzzle to solve. Plato's Phaedo immortalized the scene, the philosopher debating ethics even as his limbs grew numb, his friends weeping while he remained eerily composed. But modern scholars have questioned this saintly portrayal. Was Socrates truly the serene martyr Plato depicted, or did the account romanticize a far messier reality? Hemlock poisoning is agonizing, causing gradual paralysis and suffocation, hardly the peaceful fate Plato suggests. Some historians argue his calm demeanor might have been embellished to cement his legacy as philosophy's first martyr. The political undercurrents of his trial are impossible to ignore. Athens in the late 5th century was a tinderbox of paranoia, fresh off losing the Peloponnesian War and ruled by a faction that had briefly overthrown democracy. Many of Socrates' former associates, like the notorious Alcibiades, had betrayed the city or aligned with its enemies. Though Socrates himself never took sides, his reputation as a teacher of dissidents made him a target. The jury's vote was close, just 280 to 220, highlighting how divided Athens was over his fate. Even the choice of hemlock, a slow and humiliating death, felt like a deliberate message. This wasn't just punishment, but a symbolic erasure of his influence. What makes Socrates' death resonate centuries later isn't just the injustice. It's the way it forces us to confront the tension between truth and power. His trial wasn't an outlier, it was a blueprint. Think of Galileo silenced by the church, or dissidents throughout history punished not for crimes but for asking uncomfortable questions. And that's the real irony. Athens condemned Socrates to protect its ideals, but in doing so, it immortalized him. The man who declared the unexamined life is not worth living became the ultimate test of a society's willingness to tolerate scrutiny. Yet the most haunting question isn't about his death, it's about ours. How many modern institutions, when pressed by uncomfortable truths, would react any differently than ancient Athens? Socrates didn't just drink hemlock, he held up a mirror, and the reflection still unnerves us today. His final lesson wasn't about accepting fate, but about the cost of thinking freely in a world that often prefers silence. And that's why his story endures, not as a relic of the past, but as a warning and a challenge that remains terrifyingly relevant. Rasputin's death reads like something torn from a horror novel, a brutal, drawn-out struggle that defied logic at every turn. The so-called Mad Monk had spent years weaving himself into the heart of Imperial Russia, gaining the obsessive trust of Tsarina Alexandra through his alleged ability to ease her son's hemophilia. But by 1916, his influence over the royal family had made him a target for nobles desperate to sever his grip on power. What followed wasn't just an assassination, it was an exorcism, an almost ritualistic attempt to erase a man who seemed supernatural in his resilience. The plot began with an invitation to Prince Felix Yusupov's palace on a freezing December night. Yusupov, along with other conspirators, lured Rasputin under the guise of introducing him to his wife, Irina. They served him cakes and wine laced with enough cyanide to kill several men, yet Rasputin showed no effects. Some accounts claim he merely complained of a dry throat, while others suggest the poison might have been neutralized by sugar or even his notorious tolerance for alcohol. When the poison failed, Yusupov retrieved a revolver and shot him point-blank in the chest. Rasputin collapsed, seemingly dead, only to rise again moments later, attacking Yusupov before staggering into the courtyard. What happened next cemented the legend. The conspirators fired 3 more shots, one striking his head at close range. They bound his body, wrapped it in cloth, and dumped it into the icy Neva River. But when his corpse was recovered days later, the autopsy revealed lungs filled with water, proof he'd still been alive when he hit the river, struggling underwater until his final breath. This wasn't just murder, it was overkill, as if his assassins feared he might somehow return even from the grave. The chilling irony, Rasputin had foreshadowed his own demise. Months earlier, he'd written a letter to the Tsar predicting that if he were killed by nobles, the royal family would be dead within 2 years. Whether through prophecy or sheer political intuition, he was right. The Romanovs fell in 1918, executed by Bolsheviks in a basement. To some, Rasputin's death marked the beginning of the end for Imperial Russia, a violent omen of the chaos to come. But what truly fascinates isn't just the brutality of his end, it's the way his killer's desperation mirrors the fear he inspired. They didn't just want him dead, they needed him erased, as if his very existence threatened the natural order, and perhaps it did. Rasputin, with his peasant mysticism and unchecked sway over the throne, embodied everything the aristocracy despised. His death, drenched in poison, bullets, and river water, wasn't just a crime, it was a last frantic attempt to reclaim a world already slipping through their fingers. Even now, the details resist tidy explanation. How did he survive cyanide? Why did his body refuse to die? Science offers theories: misidentified poison, the delayed effects of cold, but none fully dispel the aura of the uncanny. Rasputin's end wasn't just an assassination, it was the stuff of nightmares, a real-life monster who wouldn't stay down, and in that sense he won. His killers sought to make him a cautionary tale, but instead they made him immortal. The man who wouldn't die became the legend that never fades. Cleopatra's death is the ultimate power play wrapped in a mystery, a final act so dramatic it's fueled debate for over 2,000 years. The last pharaoh of Egypt, a woman who'd outmaneuvered Rome's greatest generals, found herself cornered by Octavian's forces in 30 BC. With her lover Mark Antony dead by his own sword and her kingdom crumbling, she made a choice that would immortalize her, surrender on her own terms. But how exactly she met her end remains one of history's great contested moments. The official story, spun by Octavian himself, claims she died by the bite of an asp, a venomous serpent smuggled into her chambers in a basket of figs. It's a poetic image, the queen choosing a quick, painless death over the humiliation of being paraded through Rome as a trophy. Yet ancient historians like Plutarch and Cassius Dio hint at something murkier. Neither was present, and their accounts differ on key details. Was it one snake or two? Did she apply the asp to her arm or let it strike her breast? Even the location of the bite varies, leaving room for doubt. Then there's the poison theory. Cleopatra was a scholar of toxicology, rumored to have tested various poisons on condemned prisoners to find the most painless option. Some historians argue she might have ingested a lethal concoction, perhaps hemlock mixed with opium, to mimic a snake's effects without the messy reality of a live serpent. Octavian, eager to avoid the scandal of executing a woman, especially one as charismatic as Cleopatra, could have easily endorsed the asp narrative to mask a far less romantic truth. After all, a suicide by poison doesn't carry the same symbolic weight as a defiant queen embracing Egypt's sacred serpent, a creature associated with divine royalty. The lost tomb only deepens the intrigue. Ancient sources claim Cleopatra and Antony were buried together in a mausoleum near Alexandria, a site so lavish it supposedly rivaled the pyramids. But despite centuries of searching, their remains and any forensic evidence that might settle the cause of death have never been found. Underwater archaeologist Frank Godio's discoveries in Alexandria's submerged royal quarter hint at possible locations, but the tombs themselves remain elusive. Without her body, we're left with second-hand accounts and Octavian's propaganda, a narrative crafted by the victor to cement his version of events. Shakespeare's Antony and Cleopatra immortalized the romanticized snakebite, painting her death as a transcendent moment of love and defiance. But the play's famous line, "Give me my robe, put on my crown, I have immortal longings in me," is pure theater, not history. The real Cleopatra was a strategist to the last. If she chose the asp, it wasn't just for its venom. It was for the symbolism, a final message to Rome that even in death, she controlled her own story. The truth may lie somewhere between poison and propaganda. Octavian had motive to obscure the facts, whether to avoid blame for her death or to strip her of agency in defeat. What's undeniable is the genius of her final act. By dying mysteriously, Cleopatra ensured that her legend would outlive her conquerors. 2 millennia later, we're still dissecting her choices, proving that the most powerful ending isn't the one that answers all questions, it's the one that keeps us asking. Julius Caesar's assassination wasn't just a murder. It was a spectacle, a bloody performance staged in the very heart of Rome's political power. On the Ides of March in 44 BC, the man who'd conquered Gaul, defied the Senate, and declared himself dictator for life was surrounded by senators, some allies, some friends, before they turned on him like a pack of wolves. 23 dagger wounds later, Caesar lay dead at the base of Pompey's statue, a chilling irony given that Pompey had been his greatest rival. But what makes this moment so haunting isn't just the violence, it's the inevitability of it all. Caesar had spent years bending Rome's republic to his will, and in doing so, he'd signed his own death warrant. The conspiracy wasn't the work of a few disgruntled nobles. It was a coalition of nearly 60 senators, each with their own reasons for wanting him gone. Some feared he'd crown himself king, ending the republic forever. Others, like Brutus, were motivated by legacy. Descended from the man who'd driven out Rome's last king centuries earlier, Brutus was allegedly swayed by notes slapped onto statues accusing him of sleeping while Rome fell to tyranny. Even Caesar's closest allies joined the plot, proving no bond was strong enough to override their terror of his growing power. But the most eerie detail: the warnings Caesar ignored. Ancient sources describe a seer who famously told him to beware the Ides of March, a prophecy he dismissed as superstition. The night before his murder, his wife Calpurnia woke from nightmares begging him not to go to the Senate. Even Plutarch writes of sacrificial animals found without hearts, an omen so dire the priests urged him to postpone public business. Yet Caesar went anyway, driven by either arrogance or fatalism, right into the trap. The political tensions had been simmering for years. Caesar's reforms granting citizenship to provinces, redistributing land to the poor alienated the elite. His refusal to rise for senators, his adoption of godlike titles, even his plan to move the capital to Alexandria, all of it screamed monarchy to a republic built on shared power. Yet the conspirators underestimated the aftermath. They assumed killing Caesar would restore the old order, but instead it sparked civil war and paved the way for empire. In trying to save the republic, they doomed it. Brutus's role is the tragedy within the tragedy. Caesar supposedly saw him among the attackers and gasped, "You too, my child." Though historians debate whether these were his last words or poetic license, either way, the betrayal cuts deep. Brutus wasn't just a senator, he was rumored to be Caesar's illegitimate son, a man who'd fought alongside him in Gaul. His participation transformed the assassination from political act to Shakespearean drama. A personal wound as much as a public one. Was Caesar's death inevitable? The answer lies in his own choices. He'd crossed the Rubicon knowing it meant war, pardoned enemies who'd later stab him, and ignored every warning because he believed himself untouchable. In the end, Rome couldn't tolerate a man who acted like a king while claiming to serve the Republic. The daggers that killed him weren't just weapons, they were the backlash of a system pushed too far. And the greatest irony, the man who famously said, "The die is cast," when he seized power never foresaw how thoroughly that gamble would cost him everything. Caesar's murder didn't just end a life, it revealed a truth about power. No amount of brilliance, no string of victories can shield you from the consequences of ambition unchecked. The conspirators thought they were saving Rome, but all they did was prove that some destinies can't be escaped, least of all the one you create for yourself. The Roanoke colony's disappearance is the kind of mystery that gnaws at you, a puzzle so baffling it spawned everything from sober historical theories to outright ghost stories. In 1587, over 100 English settlers landed on Roanoke Island, off the coast of what's now North Carolina, led by John White. But when White returned from a supply trip to England 3 years later, the colony had vanished without a trace. No bodies, no battle scars, just an eerie silence and a single word carved into a wooden post, Croatoan. It's a clue that's haunted historians for centuries, a breadcrumb that leads everywhere and nowhere at once. One school of thought suggests the colonists simply assimilated with the local Croatoan tribe, a peaceful indigenous group living on nearby Hatteras Island. Archaeological digs there have turned up European artifacts, a signet ring, sword hilts, even fragments of English pottery, mixed with native tools hinting at cultural blending. Some accounts from later settlers mention encounters with light-skinned tribe members who spoke of ancestors from the sea, fueling speculation that the Roanoke group sought refuge with the Croatoans after food shortages or conflicts with other tribes. But if that's true, why leave behind the cryptic carving instead of a clearer message? Then there's the darker theory, massacre. The colonists arrived during a time of escalating tension between English explorers and local tribes, particularly the Secotan, who'd grown hostile after earlier encounters with settlers. A neighboring tribe's oral history, passed down for generations, tells of an attack on a group of Europeans around that time. But no mass graves have ever been found, and the absence of weapons or signs of struggle makes this explanation feel incomplete. Supernatural explanations creep in where history falls short. Some point to the island's long reputation as a place of strange lights and whispers, paranormal tales that inspired everything from colonial-era ghost stories to modern horror films. Then there's the Dare Stones hoax of the 1930s, a series of engraved rocks supposedly left by Elena Dare, daughter of John White, claiming the colony was wiped out by vengeful spirits. Though debunked, the stones tapped into a deeper anxiety, the idea that Roanoke didn't just vanish but was taken, swallowed by something beyond understanding. The real horror isn't the lack of answers, it's how the mystery reflects our fear of the unknown. Roanoke was England's first attempt at permanent settlement in the New World, a venture that promised glory but instead became a cautionary tale. That single word, Croatoan, isn't just a clue, it's a Rorschach test. For some, it's proof of integration, for others, a desperate cry for help, and for the rest, a door left slightly ajar, inviting us to imagine the worst. Perhaps the most unsettling possibility is that we'll never know. Roanoke's fate lies in the gaps between history and legend, a reminder that even in an age of satellites and DNA, some stories refuse to be solved. And maybe that's why it endures, not as a historical cold case, but as a mirror. It asks us what we do when faced with the unimaginable. Carve a single word into a post and hope against all odds that someone will understand. Mozart's death at just 35 years old feels like a cruel twist of fate, a genius silenced in his prime. His final composition, the Requiem, left unfinished as if the universe itself refused to let him complete his own elegy. Officially, the cause was recorded as severe miliary fever, a vague term that could point to anything from strep throat to rheumatic fever, but the rumors that swirled in Vienna's gossip mills told a darker story. At the center of it all stood Antonio Salieri, Mozart's rival and court composer, whose alleged envy supposedly drove him to poison the younger maestro. The idea took root in popular imagination, immortalized in plays and later in Amadeus, but how much of it was truth and how much was sensational fiction? The poisoning theory gained traction because it fit a narrative too tempting to resist. The embittered older artist overshadowed by a prodigy whose talent burned too bright. Witnesses reported Salieri's erratic behavior in later years, including claims he confessed to the murder on his deathbed. Yet historians have found no tangible evidence, no poison receipts, no incriminating letters, just hearsay fueled by Vienna's cutthroat musical politics. What's often overlooked is that Salieri had little motive. By 1791, Mozart was drowning in debt, his popularity waning, while Salieri enjoyed steady patronage from Emperor Joseph II. If anything, Mozart's erratic finances and mounting stress made him a far likelier candidate for self-destruction than assassination. Modern medical reviews suggest a more mundane culprit, rheumatic fever, a complication of strep infections Mozart reportedly suffered from repeatedly. His final letters describe swelling, joint pain, and rashes, classic symptoms. Add to that the era's brutal treatments like bloodletting, which would have weakened him further, and the mystery starts to unravel. But even this explanation doesn't quiet the whispers entirely, because Mozart's burial only deepened the intrigue. His funeral was anything but fitting for a man of his stature. No grand procession, no public mourning, just a pauper's grave in St. Mark's Cemetery, his body dumped into an unmarked mass plot. The image of history's greatest composer vanishing into a communal pit feels like a final insult, but the reality was less dramatic. Vienna's burial laws at the time required quick, modest interments to prevent disease, and Mozart wasn't as destitute as myth suggests. His widow, Constance, held a memorial service days later, and contemporary records show she spent what little money she had on a proper coffin. The true tragedy isn't neglect, it's that the grave's exact location was lost over time, leaving us with no monument to match his legacy. Perhaps the most haunting detail is the Requiem itself. Commissioned anonymously by a count aiming to pass it off as his own work, the piece became shrouded in ominous symbolism. Mozart, already delirious with fever, became obsessed with the idea he was writing his own funeral mass. "I feel it, I will not last much longer," he allegedly told his wife. Whether prophecy or paranoia, the sentiment stuck, turning the Requiem into a ghostly duet between the composer and his impending death. In the end, the salary myth persists not because it's true, but because it's seductive. We want villains in our tragedies, not banal explanations like fever or bureaucracy. Mozart's real end, a sick man, drained by illness and exhaustion, buried without fanfare, doesn't carry the same weight as a tale of poisoned wine and artistic rivalry. But maybe that's the point. Genius doesn't always get a heroic exit. Sometimes it's just a fever, a hurried burial, and a melody cut short, leaving us to wonder forever what might have been. Joan of Arc's execution wasn't just a burning. It was a meticulously staged political assassination disguised as a religious trial. The 19-year-old peasant girl who'd rallied France's armies to victory against the English found herself trapped in a web of betrayal. Her capture in 1431, orchestrated by Burgundian allies who sold her to the English for 10,000 livres. But her trial for heresy was never about piety. It was about silencing a symbol. The English needed her condemned by the church to undermine her divine mission, to prove she wasn't heaven sent but a heretic, and thus invalidate the French crown she'd fought to restore. The trial transcripts reveal a chilling manipulation. Interrogated for months by clergy loyal to England, Joan was grilled on everything from her visions to her decision to wear men's clothing, a charge twisted into evidence of rebellion against God's natural order. Her answers, often shrewd and defiant, didn't matter. The verdict was decided before she ever stepped into the courtroom. Even her abjuration, a moment of apparent surrender where she signed a confession under threat of immediate execution, was used against her. When she later recounted, reclaiming her voices as divine, it gave her judges the excuse they needed. Relapse into heresy meant the fire was inevitable. The speed of her execution tells its own story. Condemned on May 30, 1431, she was burned at the stake in Rowan's marketplace the same morning, her body reduced to ashes and thrown into the Seine to prevent relics. But here's the twist: her judges had broken canon law. By denying her legal counsel and stacking the trial with partisan clergy, they'd rigged the process from the start. 25 years later, a posthumous retrial ordered by a French king eager to rehabilitate her legacy exposed the fraud, declaring her innocent and martyred. Yet the damage was done. The girl who'd heard saints and turned the tide of war had been erased, at least on paper. What makes Joan's legacy so enduring is how thoroughly she defied every box her enemies tried to put her in. A woman leading armies, a mystic dictating strategy to generals. Her very existence upended medieval hierarchies, and that terrified the powers of her time. Today, she's claimed by everyone from feminists to nationalists, a saint canonized in 1920, yet still debated as both holy icon and political pawn. Even her visions, dismissed as psychosis by skeptics, celebrated as divine by believers, resist easy explanation. The real tragedy isn't just her death, it's how little the world around her changed. The church that burned her later sanctified her. The English she fought eventually lost their French holdings, and Joan herself became everything her executioners feared: immortal. Her name now dwarfs those of the men who condemned her, a reminder that some fires don't destroy, they illuminate. In the end, her trial wasn't just a verdict on one girl. It was a test of who gets to decide what's sacred, and history's answer was unequivocal: not the ones who lit the match. Bruce Lee's death at the age of 32 should have been impossible. A man whose body and mind were honed to near perfection, struck down by something as mundane as cerebral edema. On July 20, 1973, the martial arts legend collapsed in his Hong Kong apartment after complaining of a headache, slipping into a coma from which he never woke. The official cause: swelling of the brain, a condition as sudden as it was baffling. But for a figure who defied limits his entire life, an ordinary medical explanation felt insufficient, even suspicious. Almost instantly, whispers of foul play and curses began to circulate, each more unsettling than the last. One of the most persistent theories points to heatstroke. Lee had been filming Game of Death in scorching conditions, pushing himself through grueling fight scenes without proper hydration. Earlier that year, he'd collapsed during a dubbing session, suffering seizures later attributed to heat exhaustion. Could repeated exposure have triggered the fatal swelling? Some physicians argue yes, citing cases where extreme physical stress leads to brain inflammation. But others note that Lee was a fitness fanatic. His body adapted to punishing workouts, making a heat-related death seem strangely out of character. Then there's the medication angle. Lee was taking Equagesic, a painkiller containing aspirin and a muscle relaxant to manage chronic back pain. An autopsy found trace amounts in his system, leading to speculation about an allergic reaction or overdose. Yet the dosage was too low to be lethal, and no prior history of adverse effects existed. The real wild card, the coroner's discovery of cannabis in his stomach, likely consumed to ease pain, but seized upon by conspiracy theorists as proof of poisoning. Never mind that cannabis doesn't cause brain swelling. The mere presence of something unexpected was enough to fuel doubt. The darkest theories involved the Hong Kong triads. Lee's meteoric rise had ruffled feathers in an industry where organized crime held significant influence. Rumors swirled that he'd refused payoffs or angered powerful figures, leading to a retaliatory hit. Even his son Brandon's tragic death years later, shot with a prop gun under murky circumstances on the set of The Crow, was dragged into the narrative, framed as part of a family curse. Never mind that no credible evidence ties either death to criminal activity. The idea of a shadowy vendetta persists, stoked by the eerie timing of both tragedies. Supernatural explanations crept in too. Some pointed to The Big Boss, Lee's breakthrough film, where his character famously dies in a climactic fight, a plot twist some audiences took as a bad omen. Others whispered about a mysterious dragon's curse, citing an old Chinese belief that those who harness too much power too young are doomed to fall. It's a narrative that thrives on symbolism. The dragon, a creature of unimaginable strength, struck down at its zenith. The truth, as always, is probably simpler and sadder. Lee's autopsy revealed an abnormally enlarged brain, a condition that may have made him prone to edema. Combined with exhaustion, painkillers, and the relentless pressure of fame, it's plausible his body simply gave out. But plausibility doesn't satisfy the way mystery does. Bruce Lee wasn't just an actor, he was a force of nature, a man who rewrote the rules of what a human body could achieve. For someone like that to die quietly in his sleep feels wrong, a cosmic joke in poor taste. That's why the theories endure. They're not just about explaining a death, they're about reconciling the unimaginable. How could someone who moved like water, who seemed invincible on screen, be felled by something as random as a swollen brain? The answer might lie in medical reports, but the legend that lives in the shadows, where curses and conspiracies blur the line between fact and the stories we need to tell ourselves. Bruce Lee didn't just leave behind a legacy of punches and philosophy. He left us with a riddle, one that even his lightning-fast reflexes couldn't dodge. The Romanovs' execution wasn't just a political act, it was an erasure, a deliberate attempt to extinguish an entire dynasty in a single night. On July 17, 1918, Tsar Nicholas II, his wife Alexandra, and their 5 children Olga, Tatiana, Maria, Anastasia, and the hemophiliac heir Alexei were roused from sleep in the basement of a house in Yekaterinburg, told they were being moved for safety. Moments later, a firing squad opened fire in the cramped space, cutting them down in a hail of bullets and bayonets. The brutality was methodical. The family's jewels, sewn into their clothing as a desperate safeguard, deflected initial shots, forcing the executioners to finish the job at point-blank range. Even then, the killers weren't satisfied. They doused the bodies in acid, burned them, and dumped them into a mine shaft, all to ensure no relics could inspire monarchist sentiment. For decades, the Bolsheviks obscured the truth, claiming only Nicholas had been executed while the rest of the family was relocated. But the lie couldn't hold. Rumors swirled that one of the Grand Duchesses, Anastasia, the most mischievous and photogenic of the siblings, had survived. The myth took root in pop culture, fueled by a parade of imposters, most famously Anna Anderson, a woman who spent 60 years insisting she was Anastasia, even as evidence mounted against her. The legend was irresistible, a princess slipping through the cracks of history, a fairy-tale survivor in a world that had no place for royalty. The truth, when it finally emerged, was far grimmer. In 1991, amateur sleuths discovered a mass grave near Yekaterinburg, its contents matching the dimensions of the Romanovs and their servants. DNA testing confirmed the identities of Nicholas, Alexandra, and 3 of their daughters, but 2 bodies were missing: Alexei and 1 sister, either Maria or Anastasia. The discovery reignited old speculation. Had someone escaped? The answer came in 2007, when a second grave was found nearby, containing the remains of the 2 missing children. Science had closed the case, yet the Anastasia myth refused to die, proof of how deeply we crave stories of hope in the face of horror. What makes the Romanovs' fate so haunting isn't just the violence, it's the cold calculation behind it. The killers weren't just eliminating a former ruler, they were exterminating a symbol. The children, innocent of their parents' politics, were murdered purely for their bloodline. The decision came from the highest levels of the Bolshevik regime, with Lenin himself likely approving the orders. Even the timing was strategic. The White Army was advancing on Yekaterinburg, and the Reds couldn't risk the Tsar being rescued. The aftermath played out like a grim epilogue. The Soviet Union spent years sanitizing the story, turning Nicholas into a caricature of incompetence while erasing his family altogether. Meanwhile, the royal relatives abroad, many of whom had refused asylum to the Romanovs during their captivity, feuded over dynastic claims, their squabbles a pathetic footnote to the tragedy. And the murder site, it became a shrine, a place where monarchists still gather to lay flowers, their reverence a quiet rebuke to the revolution's promise of a fairer world. The Romanovs' end wasn't just a family's demise, it was the death of an era. Their skeletons, once hidden in unmarked pits, now rest in St. Petersburg's Peter and Paul Cathedral. Their DNA-confirmed identities a final rebuttal to decades of denial. But the lesson lingers. In revolutions, symbols are often more dangerous than people, and innocence is no shield when history decides to make an example. The bullets in that basement didn't just kill a Tsar and his children. They killed the very idea of kingship in Russia, leaving behind a mystery that's no longer about who died but why we still care. Marilyn Monroe's death should have been a straightforward tragedy, a Hollywood icon found lifeless in her Brentwood home on August 5, 1962, an empty bottle of sleeping pills nearby. The coroner ruled it a probable suicide, but from the moment the news broke, nothing about her final hours felt simple. The official story was riddled with inconsistencies: the missing toxicology report, the suspicious timing of her housekeeper's phone call to police, and the eerie fact that Monroe's psychiatrist, Dr. Ralph Greenson, had been at her home just hours before her body was discovered. Then there were the whispers, ones that grew louder over the years, tying her death to the most powerful men in America. The Kennedy connection is the elephant in the room. Monroe's alleged affairs with both President John F. Kennedy and his brother Robert have been the stuff of tabloids for decades, but declassified FBI files add chilling weight to the speculation. Memorandums mention her as a security risk, referencing her rumored knowledge of classified conversations, particularly about Cuba and the mafia, that could have embarrassed the administration. One memo even cryptically notes she'd threatened to tell all about the brothers in a press conference. Just months before her death, She was famously fired from her Fox contract after disappearing during the chaotic production of Something's Got to Give, fueling theories she'd become too volatile, too unpredictable for the Kennedys' comfort. The scene in her bedroom only deepened the mystery. Though empty pill bottles littered the nightstand, Monroe's stomach showed no trace of the capsules, just a suspiciously high concentration of barbiturates in her liver, suggesting intravenous injection rather than oral ingestion. The missing toxicology report, allegedly destroyed by the Los Angeles County Coroner's Office, became a smoking gun for conspiracy theorists. Even the housekeeper's account raised eyebrows. She claimed to have noticed Monroe's locked door and strange light under it at midnight, but didn't call authorities until nearly 4 in the morning. What happened in those missing hours? Not everyone believes murder was the only alternative to suicide. Some biographers argue Monroe's death was accidental, a miscalculated dose during one of her frequent bouts of insomnia, exacerbated by her fragile mental state. Friends recounted her habit of pill cocktails, mixing sedatives with champagne to knock herself out, a reckless routine that could easily tip into overdose. Her psychiatrist had recently increased her prescriptions, and the combination of Nembutal and chloral hydrate found in her system was notoriously lethal. But this theory, too, falters under scrutiny. Why were there no pill remnants in her stomach? Why had someone, possibly Greenson, administered a saline enema shortly before her death, a bizarre detail noted in the autopsy? The most haunting question isn't just how Monroe died, but why the truth remains so elusive. Was it a cover-up to protect the Kennedys, a silencing orchestrated by those who saw her as a liability? Or simply a star's self-destruction magnified by the glare of fame? Even her bedroom phone logs disappeared, along with pages from a diary. The LAPD's handling of the case was so sloppy or deliberate that investigators failed to photograph the death scene properly, lost key evidence, and didn't fingerprint the pill bottles. Monroe's death transcends the boundaries of a Hollywood scandal. It's a prism reflecting our obsession with beauty, power, and the stories we're willing to believe. The official narrative asks us to accept that a woman at the peak of her fame, with projects on the horizon and a home being redecorated, chose to end her life on a quiet Sunday night. The alternative forces us to confront something darker, that America's sweetheart might have been sacrificed to protect the secrets of the very men who adored her. Either way, the real tragedy isn't just that Marilyn Monroe died too soon, it's that we may never know who or what really killed her. Christopher Marlowe's death reads like a scene ripped from one of his own plays, a brilliant mind cut down in a tavern brawl, his life bleeding out on a Deptford floor in 1593. Officially, the coroner ruled it a drunken fight gone wrong, with Marlowe stabbed above the eye by a man named Ingram Fraser over something as trivial as a bar tab. But for a playwright whose work teemed with political intrigue and whose personal life was tangled in Elizabethan England's shadowy spy networks, such a mundane end feels suspiciously convenient. The timing alone raises eyebrows. Marlowe was just 29 at the height of his literary fame, with Dr. Faustus and Tamburlaine electrifying London stages. Yet his real legacy might have been his ties to the Crown's Secret Service. Historians have unearthed evidence linking him to Sir Francis Walsingham's intelligence web, where poets and playwrights often doubled as informants. Marlowe's missions allegedly took him to Catholic seminaries in France, infiltrating plots against Queen Elizabeth. But in the weeks before his death, he'd become a liability. Arrested for heresy after accusations of atheism, a capital offense, he was out on bail awaiting trial when Fraser's dagger found him. Coincidence or a silenced loose end? The inquest report reeks of stage theatrics. Marlowe spent the entire day in that Deptford room with Fraser and 2 other men, all connected to Walsingham's circle. They claimed they'd been discussing the reckoning, a term that could mean settling finances or settling scores. When the stabbing occurred, witnesses described it as self-defense, Fraser acting in fear of his life. But the wound's placement, a single upward thrust through the eyelid, suggests a precise, almost execution-style kill. Even stranger, Fraser was pardoned within a month, his crime deemed justifiable by the Queen herself. Then there's the curious case of Marlowe's death mask. In the 19th century, a German scholar claimed to possess a plaster cast of the playwright's face taken post-mortem. The face bore a gash above the right eye, matching the coroner's report, but skeptics noted the mask also showed signs of a broken nose and disfigurement absent from contemporary descriptions of Marlowe. Was it a fake or evidence the body wasn't his at all? Some theorists argue Marlowe faked his death to escape heresy charges, surfacing later as, of all people, William Shakespeare. The idea is outrageous, but it speaks to how little we truly know. The darkest theory points to rival factions within Elizabeth's court. Marlowe's patron, Thomas Walsingham, was a cousin to the spymaster Francis, but power struggles were constant. If Marlowe knew too much about, say, the Babington plot's aftermath, or if his atheistic rants threatened to expose high-placed figures, his murder could have been a clean solution. Even his literary output hints at danger. The Jew of Malta and Edward II seethe with subversive critiques of power, the kind that might anger the wrong people. What makes Marlowe's demise so haunting isn't just the unanswered questions, it's the way his life and death blur into his art. Here was a man who wrote about Faust selling his soul for knowledge, about overreaching giants toppled by their own ambition. And then he himself fell violently, mysteriously, as if scripted by some unseen playwright. Whether killed for his politics, his mouth, or a genuine tavern squabble, his end feels like a final act too perfect to be random. And perhaps that's the point. In Tudor England, where poets spied and spies wrote poetry, the line between art and reality was always thin, especially when blood was involved. 4 centuries later, we're left with a corpse, a questionable pardon, and a legacy that refuses to stay buried. Marlowe's story isn't just a cold case, it's a mirror held up to the era's paranoia, where a knife in the wrong place could be both crime and statecraft. And that's the real tragedy, not that he died young, but that his truth might have died with him, leaving us to wonder if history's greatest mysteries aren't accidents at all, but carefully staged scenes. The case of D.B. Cooper is the ultimate vanishing act, a skyjacking so audacious it's become the stuff of legend. On November 24, 1971, a man identifying himself as Dan Cooper boarded Northwest Orient Airlines Flight 305 in Portland, bound for Seattle. Wearing a suit, sunglasses, and a calm demeanor, he handed a note to a flight attendant claiming to have a bomb. His demand, $200,000 in cash and 4 parachutes. What followed was a midair heist straight out of a Hollywood script. After the plane landed in Seattle to deliver the ransom, Cooper released the passengers but kept the crew aboard, ordering them to fly toward Mexico. Somewhere over the fog-shrouded forests of the Pacific Northwest, he lowered the rear stairs and leapt into the night with the money strapped to his body. No one ever saw him again alive, at least. For decades, the question of Cooper's survival has haunted investigators and amateur sleuths alike, the prevailing theory. He couldn't have made it. The jump occurred over rugged terrain in near-freezing temperatures, wearing only a business suit and loafers. Even experienced skydivers called it suicidal. But in 1980, a boy digging along the Columbia River stumbled upon 3 bundles of decaying $20 bills, nearly $6,000 in all, matching the serial numbers from the ransom. The location suggested Cooper might have landed near the river, but no parachute, clothing, or remains were ever found nearby. Was the money washed downstream by currents or deliberately placed to mislead? The discovery only deepened the mystery. Recent breakthroughs have reignited the hunt. In 2017, a team analyzing particles on the clip-on tie Cooper left behind identified rare earth elements linked to titanium production, a clue pointing to someone with ties to the aerospace industry. Then there's the case of Robert Rackstraw, a Vietnam veteran and skilled parachutist named as a prime suspect in 2016. Investigators noted his military training, his proximity to the drop zone, and a history of fraud. But with Rackstraw's death in 2019, any chance of confirmation died with him. Another promising lead surfaced in 2021 when a group of scientists applied genetic genealogy to particles from the Thai, narrowing the suspect pool to a man with ties to the Pacific Northwest. But the FBI has remained tight-lipped on further details. The most tantalizing possibility: Cooper didn't just survive, he thrived. Some theorists argue the hijacking was too meticulously planned to be a suicide mission. The demand for 4 parachutes ensuring spares as backups, the choice of a nighttime drop near known smuggling routes, even the timing, days before Thanksgiving when law enforcement would be distracted. If Cooper did land safely, the untouched ransom money suggests he never needed to spend it, hinting at a motive beyond greed. Was it a thrill, a statement, or a personal vendetta against the airline? What makes Cooper's story endure isn't just the unanswered questions, it's the sheer audacity of the act. In an era before high-tech security, a man in a suit and tie could commandeer a plane, vanish into thin air, and leave behind nothing but a legend. The FBI closed its active investigation in 2016, but the case remains a cultural obsession, inspiring books, documentaries, and even copycats. Every few years, a new suspect emerges, a new theory takes hold, and the chase begins anew. Perhaps the truth lies buried in some unmarked grave, or maybe Cooper is still out there, an old man chuckling at the chaos he unleashed. Either way, his legacy is secure: the ghost of the sky, the man who defied gravity and disappeared into myth. And that's the real genius of D.B. Cooper. He didn't just escape a plane, he escaped history itself, leaving us to wonder if the greatest heist wasn't the money, but the mystery. Harry Houdini, his death should have been impossible, the world's greatest escape artist, felled by something as ordinary as a punch to the stomach. But the truth behind his final days is stranger than any of his stage tricks. In October 1926, a young student named J. Gordon Whitehead visited Houdini's dressing room in Montreal, where he delivered a series of blows to the magician's abdomen before Houdini was ready. Though in pain, Houdini insisted on performing that night, refusing to let a little discomfort derail his showmanship. Within days, however, he collapsed with acute appendicitis. By the time doctors operated, peritonitis had set in, and the man who cheated death countless times couldn't escape this final trap. But was it really just a punch that killed him, or does the shadow of something darker loom over his demise? Rumors of poison swirled almost immediately. Houdini had spent years waging a very public war against fraudulent spiritualists, exposing their tricks in books and lectures. His crusade made him powerful enemies, including prominent mediums who'd seen their livelihoods threatened by his relentless debunking. Some theorized one of these rivals might have slipped him a slow-acting toxin, weakening his body so that even a minor injury could become fatal. The punch, they argued, was merely the final trigger, not the true cause. Even Houdini himself reportedly whispered suspicions on his deathbed, though no concrete evidence ever surfaced to support the claim. Then there's the eerie aftermath. Houdini's wife, Bess, spent the next decade holding annual seances on the anniversary of his death, attempting to contact him beyond the grave. Though she never claimed success, the tradition became legendary, perpetuated by magicians and paranormal enthusiasts alike. The irony is palpable. The man who dedicated his life to exposing the fraud of spiritualism became the centerpiece of its most enduring ritual. Some say Bess's seances were a tribute, others believe she knew something the public didn't, that Houdini's death wasn't as random as it seemed. Modern medical experts weigh in with a more mundane, though no less tragic, explanation. Houdini had likely been suffering from undiagnosed appendicitis for days before the punch, his pain masked by sheer stubbornness. The blows to his abdomen could have ruptured the already inflamed appendix, accelerating the infection that ultimately killed him. But even this theory doesn't quite silence the whispers. Houdini's immune system was legendary. He'd survived freezing rivers, straitjacket suspensions, and buried alive stunts. For a man who trained his body to withstand impossible conditions, death from a ruptured appendix feels almost insultingly ordinary. The most haunting question isn't how he died, but whether he saw it coming. In his final years, Houdini became increasingly obsessed with death, not just as a stage spectacle, but as an inevitable reality. His battles against spiritualists weren't just about exposing fraud. They were a defiance of the unknown, a refusal to let charlatans profit from grief. And yet, in the end, his own demise became shrouded in the same mysticism he'd fought so hard to dismantle. Houdini's legacy isn't just a story of escapes, it's a story of contradictions. The man who mocked the afterlife became its most famous posthumous icon. The skeptic who demanded proof found himself at the center of an unprovable mystery. Maybe that's the greatest trick he ever pulled, leaving us wondering long after the curtain fell whether his death was truly an accident or the final act of a lifelong illusion. Abraham Lincoln's assassination wasn't just a murder. It was a meticulously orchestrated coup, a blow designed to decapitate a nation already reeling from civil war. On April 14, 1865, just 5 days after Robert E. Lee's surrender at Appomattox, the president sat in Ford's Theater, unaware that actor John Wilkes Booth had spent months plotting his demise. Booth's bullet to the back of Lincoln's head was only the centerpiece of a far more ambitious plan: simultaneous attacks on Vice President Andrew Johnson and Secretary of State William Seward, aimed at plunging the government into chaos. But what makes this night so chilling isn't just the violence, it's the eerie foreshadowing that haunted Lincoln in the days leading up to it. Days before his death, Lincoln recounted a vivid dream to his wife and close aides. In it, he wandered the White House, drawn by the sound of muffled sobs, until he entered the East Room and found a corpse lying in state, guarded by soldiers. When he asked who had died, one replied, "The president. He was killed by an assassin." The dream unsettled him so deeply that he reportedly told bodyguard Ward Hill Lamon, "I believe I shall meet with some terrible end." Skeptics dismiss it as coincidence, but others wonder, was it a premonition or something darker? Lamon himself later wrote that Lincoln's preoccupation with assassination bordered on obsession in his final weeks, as if he sensed the net closing around him. Booth's conspiracy runs deeper than most realize. He didn't act alone. He was the charismatic frontman for a network of Confederate sympathizers, including Lewis Powell, who nearly stabbed Seward to death in his bed, and George Atzerodt, who lost his nerve and fled instead of killing Johnson. Recently unearthed letters suggest Booth may have been in contact with high-ranking Confederate officials, including Secretary of State Judah P. Benjamin, though no smoking gun has ever been found. What's undeniable is the level of coordination. The attacks were timed to occur within minutes of each other, a decapitation strike straight from the playbook of modern terrorism. The lingering question isn't just who knew, but how high the conspiracy reached. After the war, rumors swirled that Booth had been a pawn for radicals within Lincoln's own cabinet, particularly Secretary of War Edwin Stanton. Conspiracy theorists point to Stanton's erratic behavior after the shooting, his refusal to let Lincoln's body be moved to the White House, his alleged suppression of Booth's diary pages as evidence of a cover-up. More credible historians note Stanton's genuine grief, but the speculation persists, fueled by the diary's mysterious missing pages and the swift execution of several co-conspirators before they could testify. The most haunting detail of all, Booth's escape. For 12 days, he evaded one of the largest manhunts in U.S. history, slipping through swamps and safe houses with an almost supernatural ease. When Union troops finally cornered him in a Virginia barn, he was shot under murky circumstances, silenced, some argue, before he could expose accomplices. The soldier who killed him, Boston Corbett, was later declared insane, adding another layer of strangeness to an already surreal manhunt. Lincoln's death wasn't just a tragedy, it was a turning point. His vision of a lenient Reconstruction died with him, replaced by Andrew Johnson's bitter clashes with Congress and the harsh policies that followed. Booth had imagined himself a hero, a modern Brutus slaying a tyrant. Instead, he ensured Lincoln's martyrdom, transforming a polarizing figure into a unifying symbol. And that's the ultimate irony. The man who sought to destroy a presidency immortalized it, leaving behind not just a crime, but a mystery that still whispers of secrets buried too deep to find. Pyotr Ilyich Tchaikovsky's death in 1893 should have been a straightforward tragedy, the great composer succumbing to cholera after drinking unboiled water during a St. Petersburg epidemic. That's the official story, neatly recorded in the history books. But behind this sanitized version lies a web of contradictions, whispered rumors, and witness accounts so inconsistent they've fueled debate for over a century. Was his demise really an accident or a carefully staged cover-up to avoid a scandal that could have destroyed his legacy? The cholera narrative hinges on a single evening at the Lena restaurant, where Tchaikovsky allegedly consumed a glass of contaminated water. His brother Modest later claimed the composer knew the risks but shrugged them off, saying, "What does it matter?" Yet medical records from the time cast doubt. Cholera typically ravages its victims with violent, unmistakable symptoms, relentless vomiting, dehydration, blue-tinged skin, yet none of Tchaikovsky's doctors initially diagnosed him with the disease. Even stranger, visitors noted his face remained unusually composed in death, lacking the sunken features characteristic of cholera sufferers. And then there's the curious handling of his body. Despite cholera being highly contagious, officials permitted open casket viewings, with mourners even kissing his hands. If the disease was truly the killer, why risk a public health catastrophe? The alternate theory is far darker. Tchaikovsky lived in an era when homosexuality was a criminal offense in Russia, punishable by exile to Siberia. Though discreet, his relationships with men were an open secret among St. Petersburg's elite. According to accounts surfaced decades later by Soviet musicologist Alexandra Orlova, a secret court of honor, a tribunal of former schoolmates from the Imperial School of Jurisprudence, confronted Tchaikovsky over an affair with a nobleman's nephew. To avoid exposing his family to disgrace, he was allegedly given an ultimatum: suicide or public ruin. Proponents of this theory point to the composer's sudden, frantic revising of his will days before his death, as well as witness reports of him screaming in agony, a detail inconsistent with cholera's symptom progression. Most damning, the death certificate lists no cause at all, an omission unheard of for a cholera victim in a major city. The timeline itself is riddled with oddities. Tchaikovsky's final days were marked by erratic behavior, including conducting the premiere of his Sixth Symphony, the Pathétique, just days before falling ill. The symphony's mournful finale, now eerily prophetic, was described by contemporaries as a farewell to life. Even his last spoken words, accursed, feel less like the lament of a sick man and more like the outburst of someone cornered. What makes this mystery endure isn't just the conflicting evidence, it's what it reveals about the era's brutal hypocrisy. Tchaikovsky's music was celebrated as the height of Russian culture, even as the man himself lived in constant fear of exposure. His death, whether by disease or design, became a mirror held up to society's contradictions. The cholera story allowed the establishment to preserve his reputation while sidestepping scandal. The suicide theory, if true, exposes the inhuman cost of that silence. Modern scholars remain divided. Some cite the discovery of Tchaikovsky's pharmacy bills, which included cholera remedies, as proof of the official account. Others highlight the suspicious disappearance of key witnesses' letters and the Tsar's unusual permission for a public funeral, hardly the treatment given to a cholera victim. The truth may lie somewhere in between. A man already ill, perhaps with a stomach infection, pushed to despair by threats he could no longer outrun. One thing is certain, Tchaikovsky's death, like his music, resists simple resolution. The Pathétique's haunting finale doesn't provide answers. It lingers unresolved, just like the mystery of the man who wrote it, and perhaps that's fitting. In the end, the silence surrounding his death speaks louder than any official record ever could. Glenn Miller's vanishing is one of aviation's greatest enigmas, a man whose music defined an era, disappearing into the fog of war without a trace. On December 15, 1944, the famed bandleader boarded a single-engine plane in England, bound for Paris, where he was scheduled to perform for Allied troops. The skies were thick with winter mist, and Miller's aircraft, a small UC-64 Norseman, was ill-equipped for poor visibility. Minutes after takeoff, radio contact was lost. No distress call, no wreckage, just silence. The official explanation pointed to mechanical failure or pilot error, but rumors of something far more sinister took root almost immediately. One persistent theory suggests Miller's plane was accidentally downed by Allied bombers. That day, over 100 Lancaster bombers returning from an aborted mission jettisoned their payloads into the English Channel, a routine practice to reduce weight before landing. Some accounts place Miller's flight path perilously close to the drop zone, raising the possibility that his plane was struck by falling bombs or debris. Skeptics counter that no wreckage was ever found in the area, and the bomber's logs show no reports of unusual incidents. Yet the timing remains eerily plausible. Miller's disappearance coincided almost exactly with the bomber's return. Another angle involves enemy action. Though Germany's air force was in retreat by late 1944, sporadic dogfights still occurred over the channel. Some researchers point to an obscure German pilot's diary entry describing the downing of a small Allied plane that December, a claim never verified. More bizarrely, a 1984 documentary alleged that Miller actually died in a Paris brothel, his disappearance staged to cover up the scandal. The theory was swiftly debunked, but its existence speaks to how deeply the mystery has permeated pop culture. The most tantalizing twist came decades later. In 1985, a British aviation historian claimed to have uncovered wreckage matching Miller's plane in a Kentish forest, miles off course. The discovery, he argued, pointed to fuel starvation or instrument failure in the thick fog. Yet the CIA's subsequent investigation found no conclusive link, leaving the lead unresolved. Then, in 2012, a French fisherman hauled up aircraft debris near the channel's coast, metal fragments, later tentatively linked to a Norseman's specifications. But without a tail number or definitive proof, even this clue faded into ambiguity. What makes Miller's case so haunting isn't just the lack of answers, it's the cruel irony of his final mission. He'd traded sold-out shows for USO tours, determined to boost morale during the war's darkest days. His plane carried no black box, no witnesses, just the muffled roar of an engine swallowed by history. The military, perhaps sensing the public's need for closure, declared him officially dead a year later, though his name never appeared on any wartime casualty list. The truth may lie at the bottom of the channel, buried under silt and time. Or perhaps it's scattered in some forgotten archive, a single document waiting to connect the dots. Until then, Glenn Miller's legacy endures in the unresolved chord of his final flight. A melody cut short, leaving us to fill in the silence with theories, whispers, and the faint hope that one day the fog will lift. King George III's descent into so-called madness is one of history's most tragic medical mysteries, a royal unraveling that reshaped an empire. For centuries, the British monarch's violent outbursts, incoherent ramblings, and bouts of paralysis were dismissed as insanity, but modern science tells a far more complex story. The question isn't just what afflicted him, but whether his suffering was the result of a genetic quirk or something far more sinister. The porphyria theory gained traction in the 1960s when psychiatrists re-examined accounts of the king's symptoms. Porphyria, a rare metabolic disorder, disrupts the body's ability to produce heme, a component of blood. The effects are brutal. Abdominal pain so severe it mimics torture, seizures, hallucinations, and even temporary paralysis, all documented in George's medical records. His famous episode in 1788, when he reportedly spoke nonsensically for hours and foamed at the mouth, fits textbook porphyria attacks. Even the blue-tinged urine noted by his physicians aligns with the condition, as porphyrins accumulate and darken bodily fluids. Supporters of this theory point to the royal family's medical history. Descendants like Prince William of Gloucester were later diagnosed with the same disorder, suggesting a hereditary link. But there's another, darker possibility lurking in the shadows: arsenic poisoning. 18th century medicine was shockingly reckless with toxic substances. Arsenic-laced makeup, wallpaper, and even medications were commonplace, and George's doctors routinely prescribed tonics containing heavy metals. In 2005, forensic analysis of the king's hair samples revealed startling levels of arsenic, enough to trigger neurological damage. Could his madness have been slow poisoning, either accidental or deliberate? The political climate fuels suspicion. George's erratic behavior peaked during the American Revolution and the Regency crisis, moments when his perceived instability benefited those eager to sideline him. His son, the future George IV, famously clashed with him over power, and court factions had every incentive to weaken the king's grip. The truth might lie somewhere in between. Porphyria could explain George's cyclical suffering, while arsenic exposure, whether from medicines or malice, may have worsened his decline. What's undeniable is the cruelty of his treatment. Strapped into restraining chairs, blistered with hot irons to draw out toxins, and isolated in dank chambers, the king endured what we'd now recognize as torture disguised as care. His physicians, convinced his madness stemmed from an excess of bile, subjected him to purges and ice baths that only deepened his agony. Modern neurology offers a sobering perspective. George's symptoms mirror acute encephalopathy, a brain dysfunction triggered by metabolic crises. His brief periods of lucidity, followed by rapid deterioration, suggest a body in constant rebellion. Yet even this diagnosis doesn't erase the lingering question of culpability. Was his condition purely biological, or did the very people entrusted with his well-being inadvertently or intentionally hasten his ruin? The tragedy of George III isn't just his personal suffering, it's how his illness became a political weapon. Cartoonists depicted him as a babbling lunatic, while ministers quietly shifted power to his son. His final decade, spent blind, deaf, and confined to Windsor Castle, serves as a grim reminder of how easily medical ignorance and political ambition can conspire to rewrite a life. Today, we see him not as a mad king, but as a man trapped in a broken body, a cautionary tale of how history judges those who cannot speak for themselves. Anne Boleyn's execution wasn't just a royal divorce, it was a meticulously staged political assassination disguised as justice. On May 19, 1536, the woman who'd once enchanted Henry VIII enough to split England from the Catholic Church knelt on a scaffold at the Tower of London, her neck bared not for an English axe but a French swordsman's blade. The choice of weapon was telling. Henry spared no expense to ensure her death would be swift and precise, as if cleanliness could sanitize the brutality of his decision. The charges against her, adultery, incest, even plotting the king's death, were so outlandish that even contemporaries whispered of their absurdity. But beneath the spectacle lay a far simpler truth. Anne had failed to deliver the one thing Henry craved above all else: a living son. The trial was a masterclass in legal theater. Evidence included gossip from ladies-in-waiting and a coerced confession from court musician Mark Smeaton, who may have been tortured into implicating Anne. The most shocking accusation, that she'd slept with her own brother, George Boleyn, a claim so grotesque it reeked of desperation. Historians now recognize these charges as fabrications, but at the time they served their purpose, to justify Henry's ruthlessness while preserving his image as a wronged husband. Even Anne's alleged lovers' courtiers like Henry Norris and Francis Weston were executed days before her, eliminating any chance they might recount their confessions under torture. The speed of the proceedings was staggering. Arrested on May 2nd, tried on the 15th, dead by the 19th, Henry ensured there'd be no time for opposition to coalesce. Infertility was the silent crime never mentioned in court. After years of miscarriages and stillbirths, Anne's final pregnancy in 1534 ended in tragedy when she delivered a premature son who did not survive. For Henry, this was the unforgivable sin. His first wife, Catherine of Aragon, had at least given him a daughter, Mary. Anne's failure to produce a male heir shattered the illusion of divine favor he'd woven around their marriage. When Jane Seymour, her lady-in-waiting, caught his eye demure where Anne was outspoken, submissive where Anne was defiant, the stage was set. Anne's sharp tongue and political meddling, once tolerated, suddenly became treasonous in Henry's eyes. The execution itself was a macabre pantomime of mercy. Henry imported an expert swordsman from Calais, sparing Anne the brutish hacking of an axe, a small kindness that only underscored the cold calculation behind her removal. Her final speech, praising the king as a most gentle prince, was likely coerced, a scripted performance to legitimize the execution. Even in death, Henry controlled the narrative. What makes Anne's fate so chilling isn't just the injustice, it's how thoroughly her story was rewritten. The same king who defied the Pope to marry her now branded her a whore and a witch. The woman who'd helped birth the English Reformation became its first casualty, her legacy erased until historians peeled back the layers of propaganda. And perhaps that's the cruelest twist. Anne's greatest failure was giving birth to Elizabeth, the daughter Henry dismissed but who would one day eclipse him as England's most celebrated monarch. Anne's blood, spilled so carelessly on the Tower Green, seeded a future Henry could never have imagined, one where a woman's worth wasn't measured by the sons she bore, but by the brilliance she unleashed. For a man who spent his life dodging bullets and outmaneuvering law enforcement, Al Capone's end came not with a hail of gunfire, but with the slow, merciless decay of syphilis. The infamous Chicago gangster, who once ruled an empire built on bootlegging and bloodshed, spent his final years a shadow of himself, his mind unraveling in the sterile confines of Alcatraz. By the time he was released in 1939, transferred to a mental hospital after serving 7 years for tax evasion, he had the mental capacity of a child wandering the halls in confusion, convinced he was back in his old brothel headquarters. The disease, contracted decades earlier, had hollowed him out from the inside, leaving behind a husk that bore little resemblance to the swaggering kingpin who'd once dominated headlines. The irony is almost poetic. Capone's downfall began not with the law, but with his own body. Historians trace his infection to his early 20s, likely from one of the many sex workers employed in his brothels. In an era before penicillin, syphilis was a death sentence in slow motion, a disease that could lurk dormant for years before attacking the brain. By the mid-1930s, as Capone adjusted to life in Alcatraz, the symptoms became impossible to ignore. Prison doctors noted his erratic behavior, sudden outbursts, slurred speech, and moments of disorientation. At one point, he was discovered in the prison yard, staring blankly at a baseball game, unable to comprehend the rules of a sport he'd once loved. The man who'd orchestrated the St. Valentine's Day massacre could no longer tie his own shoes, yet even in decline, Capone's legend spawned unanswered questions. His net worth at his peak was estimated in the hundreds of millions adjusted for inflation, a fortune rivaling modern billionaires. But when he died in 1947, his estate was valued at a mere $50,000. Where did the money go? Some speculate it was siphoned off by former associates or hidden in offshore accounts, though no paper trail has ever surfaced. Others believe the bulk of his wealth evaporated during his imprisonment, squandered by incompetent handlers or seized through legal maneuvers, the most tantalizing theory. That Capone's family, particularly his devoted wife, managed to secretly preserve a portion of his empire, dispersing it through a web of shell companies and front businesses. Without concrete evidence, though, the fate of his fortune remains as murky as one of his backroom deals. Capone's death certificate listed the cause as cardiac arrest, but those who saw him in his final years knew the truth. Syphilis had done what rival gangs and federal agents could not. His final days were spent on his Florida estate, a shell of the man who'd once declared, "You can get much farther with a kind word and a gun than you can with a kind word alone." The disease erased not just his memories, but his very identity, leaving behind a cautionary tale about the price of power and the bodies that collect when you live by the bullet, even if you don't die by one. The real tragedy of Capone's end isn't just the physical decay, it's how thoroughly the myth outlived the man. In popular culture, he's forever frozen in his prime, clad in pinstripes and wielding a Tommy gun. But the reality was far sadder. A broken figure, forgotten by the underworld he'd built, dying quietly in his bed while the world moved on, and perhaps that's the ultimate irony. The king of crime, who'd once commanded an army of hitmen, was ultimately brought low not by violence, but by the silent, creeping consequences of his own excess. His legacy isn't just a story of rise and fall. It's a reminder that sometimes the deadliest enemies are the ones you never see coming. The fire that tore through the Sodder family home on Christmas Eve, 1945, should have been a tragedy, but what happened next turned it into one of America's most enduring mysteries. George and Jenny Sodder awoke to smoke and flames, scrambling to herd their 9 children to safety. 5 escaped, 4 were never seen again, the official explanation. A horrific accident, the children's bodies consumed by the inferno. But the Sodders refused to accept it, and the evidence they uncovered would fuel decades of suspicion, whispers of abduction, and even alleged sightings that stretched across continents. From the start, nothing about the fire made sense. Witnesses reported seeing strange lights. Some described them as flaming orbs hovering near the house before the blaze. The family's phone line, which had worked moments earlier, went dead when George tried to call for help. Even the fire itself behaved unnaturally, burning with an intensity that defied logic. Firefighters didn't arrive until the next morning, and when they sifted through the ashes, they found no trace of bone fragments or teeth. Impossible. Given the heat required to cremate a human body completely would have reduced the entire house to cinders. A neighbor claimed to have seen someone tossing small, fiery objects onto the roof, while another reported spotting a suspicious man watching the flames from a nearby hillside. Then there were the bizarre details surrounding the children. The Sodders insisted their coal furnace couldn't have sparked the fire, as investigators claimed. They'd checked it before bed, and the wiring, which authorities blamed, had been inspected just weeks prior. More chillingly, a ladder that usually leaned against the house, the only escape route from the second floor, was found mysteriously moved, as if someone had deliberately cut off the children's exit. George later discovered clumps of a strange, tar-like substance in the grass, which he believed was accelerant, but the sheriff dismissed his concerns, and no official arson investigation was ever conducted. The aftermath only deepened the mystery. A local taxi driver came forward years later, confessing he'd been paid to help kidnap the children that night, though he refused to name who hired him. Sightings trickled in. A woman in Charleston recognized one of the missing girls in a photograph, but police never followed up. In 1968, the Sodders received an anonymous envelope containing a photo of a young man they swore was their son Louis, now grown, with a cryptic note reading, "Louis Sodder. I love brother Frankie, ill boys, a 90,132 or 35. The postmark led to a dead end. Even private detectives hired by the family hit walls, their reports mysteriously vanishing from police files. The most haunting question isn't just what happened to the children, it's why. Some theorized the abduction was retaliation. George, an Italian immigrant, was openly critical of Mussolini, and rumors swirled that local mobsters targeted his family for his political views. Others pointed to a darker possibility: human trafficking. The Sodders lived near a major highway, and the timing, just months after World War II, left the region awash in displaced persons and black market networks. Then there's the simplest, saddest explanation: a cover-up. Had the fire been a gruesome accident and authorities, unwilling to admit their negligence, buried the truth to avoid scandal? For the Sodders, the search never ended. They turned their property into a memorial, erecting a billboard with the children's photos and the words, "They are not dead." Jenny died in 1989, still clutching a locket containing strands of her missing children's hair. George followed soon after, their graves marked with 5 empty spaces, waiting for answers that never came. The Sodder case isn't just a cold file. It's a rift in reality, a moment where the ordinary rules of tragedy don't apply. Most fires leave behind bodies. Most missing children leave behind clues. This one left only questions, stacking improbabilities until the only logical conclusion feels illogical. That 5 children vanished into thin air, and the truth went up in smoke with them. And maybe that's why it endures, not as a mystery to be solved, but as a wound that won't close, a reminder that sometimes the past refuses to stay buried, even when the evidence does. Akhenaten's reign was a thunderclap in ancient Egypt, a radical upheaval that shattered centuries of tradition, only to be violently erased from history. The so-called heretic pharaoh didn't just change the religion. He tore it apart, replacing Egypt's pantheon of gods with a single deity, the sun disk Aten. But his revolution died with him under circumstances so suspicious, even the sands of time haven't fully buried the evidence. The tomb intended for his burial was hastily abandoned, his name chiseled off monuments, and his capital city left to crumble. Was this merely the backlash of a resentful priesthood, or something darker? A silencing so complete it took decades for archaeologists to piece together the truth. The most glaring clue lies in Akhenaten's mummy, or rather, the lack of one. His body was never officially identified in the royal tomb he'd built at Amarna, though a gruesome discovery in tomb KV55 in the Valley of the Kings offers grim hints. The skeletal remains found there were defaced, the coffin's name hacked away, and the golden face mask ripped off, acts of posthumous vengeance reserved for Egypt's greatest enemies. Forensic analysis suggests the man in the coffin died in his 30s from catastrophic trauma, including a crushing blow to the skull. But here's where it gets stranger. DNA testing confirmed the individual was Tutankhamun's father. If this was Akhenaten, as most scholars believe, his injuries point not to natural causes, but to a brutal end at the hands of those who sought to undo his legacy. The backlash against Atenism was swift and merciless. After Akhenaten's death, his capital city was abandoned, his statues toppled, and his very name omitted from king lists as if he'd never ruled. The priesthood of Ammon, whose power he'd stripped, spearheaded this damnatio memoriae, a systematic erasure meant to purify Egypt's history. But hatred alone doesn't explain the violence done to his remains. The desecration of his corpse, the smashed skull, the erased inscriptions suggest a ritualistic killing, a message sent not just to the living but to the gods themselves. This vendetta didn't stop with Akhenaten. It cast a shadow over his son's reign. Tutankhamun, originally named Tutankhaten in honor of his father's god, was just a child when he ascended the throne. His advisors, likely remnants of the old regime, forced a dramatic reversal. The young king restored the Ammon cult, changed his name to distance himself from Aten, and moved the court back to Thebes. But the past wasn't so easily buried. The haste of Tutankhamun's own burial, the unexplained damage to his mummy, even the presence of hidden Atenist symbols in his tomb, all hint at a dynasty caught between two worlds, never fully free of its tainted origins. The greatest irony, Akhenaten's heresy outlived him. Though his name was erased, his art, those elongated, androgynous figures bathed in Aten's rays, resurfaced centuries later in unexpected ways. Some argue his monotheism influenced early Hebrew thought, while others see echoes of his revolutionary style in later Egyptian art. Even Tutankhamun's famous death mask, with its sun-gold sheen, carries whispers of the very sun cult his reign supposedly rejected. Akhenaten's death wasn't just the fall of a pharaoh. It was a warning etched in stone: cross the gods and history itself will conspire against you. But the lesson cuts deeper. Violence can erase a man, but not his ideas. The heretic king's vision, buried under layers of hatred and time, still pulses beneath the sands, waiting for us to dig it up and ask who really won. If Rasputin's murder felt like a scene from a twisted play, the fates of his killers read like its grim final act, a relentless downward spiral of exile, madness, and violent ends. The conspirators, who toasted their victory with champagne in Yusupov's palace, soon discovered that killing the mad monk didn't just fail to save the Romanovs, it unleashed a curse that seemed to cling to them like shadows. Prince Felix Yusupov, the charming aristocrat who'd lured Rasputin to his death, was the first to fall from grace. Exiled to Crimea after the revolution, he spent decades rewriting his story, penning self-serving memoirs that shifted blame and inflated his heroism. But the world wasn't kind to regicides, even failed ones. By the 1930s, he was a penniless immigrant in Paris, reduced to selling his wife Irina's jewelry to survive. The couple's only son died in a car crash at 40, a tragedy Yusupov privately blamed on Rasputin's lingering wrath. His final years were spent in delusional grandeur, hosting tea parties for imaginary guests while communist Russia erased his family's legacy. The man who'd once danced in silk robes died in 1967, forgotten by the world he'd tried to save. Then there was Vladimir Purishkevich, the nationalist firebrand who'd fired the first shots. Unlike Yusupov, he didn't flee Russia immediately. Captured by Bolsheviks during the Civil War, he somehow talked his way out of execution, only to die months later from typhus in a filthy prison hospital. His last scribbled notes raved about visions of Rasputin's ghost looming at the foot of his bed, whispering, "God sees your sins." Whether fever dream or hallucination, it was a chilling end for the man who'd once boasted of saving the empire. But the darkest fate belonged to Dr. Stanislaus de Lazovert, the physician who'd supposedly laced Rasputin's cakes with cyanide. After the murder, he vanished into obscurity, resurfacing years later in Belgrade with a shattered mind. Neighbors reported hearing him scream through the night about blue lips and burning eyes, convinced Rasputin's spirit was poisoning his dreams. He was found dead in his apartment in 1926, an empty vial of morphine beside him, a suicide that mirrored the very toxins he'd once administered. Even those tangentially linked to the plot met bizarre ends. Grand Duke Dmitry Pavlovich, Yusupov's co-conspirator, escaped execution but drifted through exile like a ghost. His engagement to an American heiress collapsed under rumors of his involvement in Rasputin's death, and he died alone in Switzerland, his lungs ravaged by tuberculosis. The servant who'd helped dispose of Rasputin's body was found frozen to death in a Petrograd alley, his pockets stuffed with undeclared Romanov jewels. The so-called curse gained traction because the timing was too precise to ignore. Within 2 years of Rasputin's murder, every major conspirator was dead, exiled, or broken, and the Romanovs themselves had been slaughtered in a basement. Coincidence, perhaps, but in a country steeped in superstition, the pattern felt like cosmic retribution. Even Yusupov's dog, a black spaniel present during the killing, reportedly went mad, tearing at its fur until it bled. What makes their fate so unsettling isn't just the suffering, it's the symbolism. These men had set out to purge Russia of a devil, only to become casualties of the very chaos they'd unleashed. Whether by curse, karma, or simple historical irony, their lives unraveled in ways that felt eerily poetic. Rasputin had once warned Nicholas II, "If I die, you will lose your son within 6 months." The Tsar's family perished in 18 months. The killers who'd imagined themselves heroes became footnotes in a tragedy far larger than themselves. And in the end, the man they'd called a monster outlived them all, not in flesh, but in legend, his death ensuring his immortality. Princess Diana's death in the early hours of August 31st, 1997, was a collision of tragedy, obsession, and unanswered questions, a moment that froze the world in shock. The Paris underpass where her Mercedes slammed into a concrete pillar at high speed became an instant shrine, but the aftermath was anything but simple. The official report pinned blame on driver Henry Paul, intoxicated and speeding to escape pursuing paparazzi. Yet from the start, inconsistencies piled up like the floral tributes outside Kensington Palace. Witnesses described a mysterious white Fiat that seemed to cut off the Mercedes, then vanished. The absence of Diana's seatbelt, the delayed emergency response, even the odd behavior of photographers at the scene, some allegedly snapping pictures instead of helping, all fed a growing sense that this was more than just a horrific accident. The paparazzi became the easiest villains. Diana's fraught relationship with the press was no secret. She'd once called them bloodthirsty for hounding her every move. That night, motorcycles chased her car through Paris, their flashing cameras disorienting the driver. But critics argue the media frenzy was a smokescreen. French authorities initially detained 9 photographers, yet all were later cleared of direct responsibility for the crash. Even Paul's blood alcohol level, reportedly 3 times the legal limit, raised eyebrows. Toxicology results were leaked suspiciously fast, and some experts questioned whether the samples were mishandled or even switched. The deeper truth. Paparazzi culture was a symptom, not the sole cause, of a system that treated Diana's life as public property right up to its chaotic end. Enter Mohammed Al-Fayed, Dodi's father, whose grief morphed into a decade-long crusade to prove the crash was murder. His claims were explosive. Diana was pregnant with Dodi's child, he alleged, and the British royal family couldn't tolerate the scandal of an heir's Muslim half-sibling. He pointed to the missing Fiat, the odd placement of security cameras that malfunctioned that night, and the rumored involvement of MI6, all dismissed by investigators but irresistible to conspiracy theorists. The most chilling detail, Al-Fayed claimed Diana had predicted her own death in a handwritten note, warning that Charles was planning an accident. The note's authenticity was debated, but its existence alone amplified the whispers. Forensic re-examinations only deepened the fog. In 2004, an 18-month British police inquiry concluded the crash was indeed accidental, yet admitted key evidence like the white Fiat was never found. Then came the 2007 inquest, where a jury ruled Diana and Dodi were unlawfully killed due to reckless driving and paparazzi harassment, but stopped short of endorsing assassination theories. Even the autopsy findings were contentious. Diana's injuries suggested her heart had been displaced, an anomaly some surgeons argued was more consistent with a high-speed collision than a simple impact. The tragedy's real legacy lies in its unresolved tension between fact and myth. Was Diana's death a terrible accident, a byproduct of fame's grotesque machinery? Or was it, as Al-Fayed insisted, the murder of the century covered up by shadowy forces? The truth may never fully surface, buried under layers of bureaucracy, grief, and the sheer weight of her legend. What's undeniable is how her end mirrored her life, dramatic, scrutinized, and forever just out of reach. Even in death, Diana remained the people's princess, a figure so luminous, so enigmatic, that the world couldn't bear to let her go without asking why. The Ystad woman's story begins with a hiker's chilling discovery in November 1970. Nestled in a rocky crevice near Bergen, Norway, lay the charred remains of a well-dressed woman, her body surrounded by burnt passports, jewelry, and a patch of scorched earth. At first glance, it could have been a tragic accident until investigators noticed the gasoline-soaked clothing, the lack of fingerprints, and the peculiar fact that her teeth had been deliberately filed down to prevent identification. This wasn't just a death, it was an erasure. What followed was a labyrinth of false identities and cryptic clues. The woman had used at least 8 aliases across Europe, each backed by meticulously forged documents. Her suitcases, found at a nearby train station, contained coded notebooks filled with strings of numbers and symbols, pages that later baffled cryptographers. Hotel staff recalled her peculiar habits, checking in under different names, refusing housekeeping, and always requesting rooms with multiple exits. She spoke fluent French and German but avoided eye contact, as if trained to blend into the background. Every detail screamed espionage, yet no intelligence agency ever claimed her. Theories spiral from the plausible to the surreal. Cold War defector, a spy abandoned by her handlers after a botched operation. The timing was suspicious. Europe in 1970 was a chessboard of clashing ideologies, and Norway's proximity to Soviet submarine activity made it a hotbed of clandestine maneuvering. Then there's the suicide angle, the bottle of sleeping pills found near her body, the staged scene suggesting self-immolation. But why go to such lengths to obscure her identity if she intended to die? Forensic breakthroughs only deepened the mystery. Isotope analysis of her teeth hinted at a childhood spent in France or Germany, while traces of a rare chemical ethyl mercury in her hair pointed to possible laboratory work. The most haunting clue, a matchbook from a Bergen cafe, its interior scrawled with the letters SONJA, a name never linked to any of her aliases. Was it a last message, a lover's note, or a red herring? 50 years later, the case remains a masterclass in unanswered questions. Advances in DNA and facial reconstruction have offered glimpses her face now immortalized in a haunting composite sketch, but her true name and mission are buried under layers of deliberate deception. The Ystad woman isn't just a cold case, she's a mirror held up to the shadows of 20th century history, where the line between spy and civilian blurred, and some secrets were meant to burn with the dead. History's greatest unsolved deaths don't just linger in the past, they tug at the present, demanding answers even as time erodes the evidence. These 30 mysteries, from Cleopatra's final moments to the Ystad woman's cryptic fate, are more than cold cases, they're windows into the limits of our knowledge. What makes them endure isn't just the absence of answers, but the tantalizing possibility that modern science and fresh discoveries might one day crack them open. Imagine DNA analysis exhuming secrets from Tutankhamun's bones, or artificial intelligence decoding the Ystad woman's ciphers. Think of the Sodder children's case, where genetic genealogy could yet match a nameless grave to a missing face. Every decade brings tools our ancestors couldn't fathom. Isotope testing pinpointing origins, facial reconstruction resurrecting the unidentified, even quantum computing potentially unraveling centuries-old encrypted documents. Yet even as technology advances, the human element remains vital. Crowdsourced investigations have reignited stalled cases, like amateur sleuths dissecting D.B. Cooper's parachute fibers or divers scouring the Pacific for Earhart's Electra. Your theories, yes, yours, might hold the missing piece. Did Rasputin's killers dose him with something stranger than cyanide? Could Marilyn Monroe's missing diary pages still surface in a private collection? The comments section isn't just a space for speculation. It's a digital detective's notebook where collective curiosity thrives. This isn't goodbye to these enigmas, it's an invitation. Subscribe and join us as we revisit these cases with every breakthrough, from archaeology journals to declassified files. Because history isn't static, it's a conversation across time where each generation gets closer to the truth. Who knows, the next upload might feature the discovery that finally rewrites one of these stories, and you'll hear it here first. Until then, keep questioning, keep digging, and remember, the past's greatest mysteries aren't locked away. They're waiting for someone like you to shine a light.